الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على ختم الأنبياء وإمام المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on Kanz al-Daqa'iq, Imam Nasafi's intermediate level primer, matan in Hanafi fiqh, which is part of the level 3 of the Seekers Islamic Studies curriculum, we have reached lesson number 6, and this is on Tayammum, the dry ablution. And we're just going to briefly recap a couple of points related to the previous lesson, which had to do with water. That firstly, it's very important to be clear what is unconditional water, right? And unconditional water is ما يتبادر إلى عند إطلاق اسم الماء, that what comes to mind when we say water, and it's not become conditioned, it's not become used, nor conditioned, nor filthy. Right? And we took these, that what is conditioned water, what is used water, what is filthy water. And we also looked at what is a large body of water. And if you can answer these 4 key questions precisely, then you're doing okay. If you can't, then we got to review significantly more than we do. Most times, like if you want to give yourself advice, you could just give yourself a default advice, just review more. That's always good advice. For students of knowledge, one of the books that the Shaykh across the world and across the centuries have encouraged students of knowledge to read when they reach this kind of level is a beautiful work by Imam Abdul Rahman ibn al-Jawzi called Sayyidul Khatir. It's a collection of his thoughts and reflections, and also when he gets grumpy. And he has amazing advice on talab al-ilm as well, some of which is quoted by Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda in various works. قيمة الزمان عند العلماء, صفحات من صبر العلماء, and in particularly those 2 works. And those are necessary reading for talab al-ilm. If you haven't read قيمة الزمان, then what are you doing? If you haven't read Safahat min Sabr al-Ulama after reading Qimat al-Zaman, then you know what to do next. Because these are things that a student knowledge just requires, and they drive one in the resolve. And we seek to be inspired by the examples of the great scholars before, and to have that urgency and that sabr and that thabat that they had. Okay. So today we're going to begin by looking at the basis of tayammum, and then the validity of tayammum, its conditions, and then its issues. So the basis of tayammum is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded in Surah An-Nisa verse 43. Right? فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. Make tayammum with sa'id, right? With sa'id is from sa'ada, yas'udu, which is that which is from the surface, right? So make tayammum from that which is pure off the clean surface of the earth, right? So that's the basis. But what is there's a condition mentioned in the verse as well, which is, what is the first part of the verse? Right before this? فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. If you do not find water, then make tayammum. Right? So the condition of tayammum goes back to عدم وجود الماء حقيقة أو حكما, is not finding water actually such that the water isn't there. And the water isn't there, either just there is no water or it's far, right? And what is far is considered ma'doom hukman, is considered as if non-existent, because hardship is lifted for us in religion. وَمَا جَعَلَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِي الدِّينِ مِنْ حَرَجٍ. If you have to go more than a mile to get water for each prayer, that'd be a hardship. And عدم الوجود حكما is عدم القدرة على استعمال الماء. Right? لعذر. Right? Is not finding the ability to use water. So the water, لم تجدوا ماء, the water could be absent, or the water is present, but you have an absence of ability to use water, which is due to the excuses. لم تجدوا ماء فتيمموا. And this is an if-then statement. The Hanafis are much more absolute about the dilalat of the Quran. Right? So here, the tayammum has been made conditional on one thing, which is لم تجدوا ماء. يعني عدم وجدان الماء is not finding water. The implication of the verse, and it encourages you to actually read the verse, right? Surah An-Nisa, verse 43, that if A, then B, right? So you're supposed to use water. If you don't find water, then make tayammum. So there's a condition. If you don't find water, then make tayammum. The implication of the verse is that in the absence of water, actually or effectively, tayammum takes the place of water. What does water do? It purifies. So tayammum, in the absence of water, is a tahara. And in the Hanafi school, in the absence of water, tayammum is a complete substitute. Right? Here, a lot of people remain kind of confused by Bab al-Tayammum. One, because they say, well, it doesn't happen that often. But the nicest summary of Bab al-Tayammum, with its in precision and clarity, is found in precision and detail, is found in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah. Right? So there's a good summary, an excellent summary, in Nur al-Idah. He mentions the conditions of tayammum. But Ala ad-Din Abidin builds on what has come previously and the conclusions of his father in the Hashia, and he mentions, right? And I would encourage you as an assignment. So there's 9 conditions, and I'll just mention them really quickly, right? That there's 9 conditions for the validity of tayammum, right? Niyya, al-udhr al-mubih, intention, a permitting excuse. Number 3, that the tayammum be بمطهر من جنس الأرض, with something purifying from the surface of the earth. Number 4, that the tayammum be with isti'ab, with complete wiping of face and hands. If you use your hands for wiping, that you use most of the hand, which is at least 3 fingers. That it be with 2 strikes, actually or effectively. Right? Number 7, that nothing be taking place that prevents validity of its validity, such as not being in a state of hayd, nifas, or that you don't have, you're not invalidating your wudu while making it. Number 8, removing anything that prevents isti'ab, that prevents complete wiping. And number 9, that if reasonably sure that the water is close, that you seek it. So these are 9 conditions of validity. They're listed in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah. If someone wants to sort of do a write-up on this and share it for review, I could share, if you volunteer to do that, I can share my page of notes on that as an assistance. Tayammum has an integral, which is wiping one's face completely and one's arms completely. It has a condition, which is intention, and it has sunnahs. Does Nasafi mention the sunnahs? Presumably you guys are prepared. Did you see the sunnahs of tayammum? Nope. That's very interesting. But they're okay. So now tayammum, right? So tayammum, the condition for tayammum is لم تجدوا ماء عدم وجدان الماء حقيقة وحكما, not finding water actually or effectively. It is understood according to Hanafis that tayammum is a complete substitute for water. In the absence of water, tayammum is a full substitute. Because Allah has made Allah created water purifying, and He's referred to this as a substitute. So A substitutes for B, meaning completely. The Shafi'is disagreed. They considered it badal darura, right? It's a substitute out of necessity, so it is limited, as a necessity is limited. So tayammum has to be made for each fard, for each time, etc., etc. If you make tayammum, in many cases you have to repeat the prayer, etc. It's a lot more strict. And we'll look at that. So, and that goes back to the verse, right? Tayammum, right? Right? Now the word tayammum, right? Yammama. The word tayammum comes from qasd. Yamma, right? Yeah. Okay. You say yammamtuhu ay qasadtuhu. I directed myself to it, meaning I sought it, right? And tayammamtuhu, this is the tafa'ul pattern. Tayammamtuhu ay taqassadtuhu. I deliberately sought it out, right? Yammama is to seek something. Tayammama, so seeking has intention underlying it. But tayammama, because the difference between fa'ala and tafa'ala. Ziyadatul mabna تدل على زيادة المعنى. So yammama has the sense of seeking. But tayammama, the tafa'ala pattern, has a sense of deliberate seeking. Right? Which is why, you know, there's a principle that the ma'ani lughawiyya, so the ulama discussed, and it's a discussion in usul al-fiqh, so outside the scope of the class, but it's important to appreciate that there's meanings of words in the Arabic language, and then there are their shar'i usages. And the ulama of usul differed that are the shar'i usages a subset of the linguistic meanings, right? So the shar'i usage is a subset. So the linguistic meaning is more general, and the shar'i meaning is more specific. Salah refers to dua, right? And in the language, And in the specific usage of salah as the ritual prayer is a subset of that meaning. That's one madhab. The other approach is that al-ma'ani al-lughawiyya mura'atun fil haqa'iq al-shar'iyya. That the linguistic meanings are taken into account, and some would say ghaliban, generally, in the shar'i usages of terms. But either way, and the two opinions are subtly different, and all the way to Ibn Abidin, they sort of leave it at that level because it's a subtle discussion. But broadly, it's not broadly, always it's important to appreciate what's the lexical sense, because sometimes you don't understand, like, why are they arguing about intention? It goes back to the word, what does tayammum mean? Okay. And then in the Sharia, it is the meaning that we'll see here. We owe tayammum to Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, right? Because it was legislated, and you can see this in Abu Saud, that it's mentioned that it was in the Ghazwat al-Marisi' that it was legislated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the tongue of His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha lost her ring. Right? And it's in the 6th year, in Sha'ban, in the 6th year of the Hijrah. And there's ikhtilaf. Is tayammum from the unique to this ummah? And this is explicitly stated in many of the texts, right? It's from the khasa'is of the ummah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? Right? Okay. But then it also, another distinguishing characteristic of the Hanafis that is brought out from the verse, فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands to make tayammum of sa'id. What is sa'id? Sa'id, from sa'ada, is something known in the Arabic language. What is sa'id? مَا يَصْعُدُ عَلَى وَجْهِ الْأَرْضِ, is that which is the surface of the earth, naturally of the surface of the earth. And the Arabs do not, and what's natural of the surface of the earth is not filthy, right? Because najasat are arida. Can earth itself on its own be filthy? No, right? So it's mafhum that it's pure. Because can any earth itself be filthy? No, right? Ma laysa bihadath laysa binajis. Right, as we've taken, whatever doesn't invalidate wudu is not filthy. So the divine command is use sa'id. So therefore, now, but then there's an ishkal. The Tarjumanul Quran, Ibn Abbas said sa'id is soil. So the Hanafis would find that interesting, because they say, look, you don't take the opinions of the Sahaba, so why are you taking their opinion here? Well, there's a back and forth. Say no, because things like that are only not understood by opinion. So that's not the qawl of Sahabi. This will be understood to be back from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You say, okay. Imam Abu Hanifa would not take that specification to be sufficient to condition the general import, because the verse implies make tayammum with sa'id. So if you use anything considered sa'id, you fulfill the divine command. So it's like the tea example. Make tea. You said, make tea. I said, yes, sir. I brought you green tea. I said, no, I wanted black tea. That's ziyada ala nas. As a Hanafi, I would complain to HR that he said I didn't fulfill the command. It's ziyada ala nas. I was going to make tea. Green tea is considered tea. Now, if I made some rare, like if I made matcha tea, maybe you could have a complaint. That we have to go back to the qadi, right? But have you ever had matcha tea? Okay, right? It could be a reasonable case, right? So this would be considered ziyada ala nas. So how do we understand this text? The approach of the Hanafis is to understand the dhanni in light of the qat'i. So we say, okay, yes, Ibn Abbas said A is B. Sa'id is turab. Very simple. If you've studied any logic, when you say A is B, right? A is B, either B equals A, mutabaqa, or B is from A, tadammun, partitive. Or talazum, A is B, that B is entailed by A. Straightforward. Is dilalat. So A, yes, Sa'id is soil, but it's not only soil, and other things. Simple. And there's numerous examples of that in the tafsir of the Sahaba of the Quran. For example, it's related from Sayyidina Ali and others about Rabbana atina fid dunya hasana. He said, fid dunya hasana is al-mar'atu salihah, is a righteous wife. Does that mean that women don't have any good in this life? No. Someone could never marry. They have no good in this life? No. And that's dilalat tadammun. A is B. So anyway, those are some background investigations. Summarizing the excuses are important. So he says, يَتَيَمَّمْ لِبُعْدِهِ مِيلًا عَنِ الْمَاءِ. One makes tayammum if a mile away from water. So يَتَيَمَّمْ, one makes tayammum if one is more than a mile away from water. Now, one can make tayammum, what's implicit is يَتَيَمَّمْ لِعُذْرٍ مُعْتَبَرٍ, if there is a considered excuse. Right? Right? And Islam now gives us some excuses. He mentions A, B, C, D, E, F. He mentions 6 excuses. There are other excuses as well, right? That you can see in Nur al-Idah or the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah. Right? لِبُعْدِهِ مِيلًا, if you're more than a mile away from the water. And this is an Arab mile, which is 1.8 kilometers. The Arab mile is slightly longer than a standard mile. Right? Now, a simple, like if you don't know these things, go and review, please. Right? There's 2 things. There is what is an excuse for tayammum, and the other is looking for water. So the excuse for making tayammum is that the water is more than a mile away. You only have to look for it in your immediate vicinity. قدر غلوة. Right? Right? So, if you're more than a mile away from water, أو لمرض, or for sickness, right? Now, لمرض, right? This encompasses several things, right? And these are summarized in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah, right? مرض يشتد أو يمتد أو يتحرك. For sickness, that becomes worse or becomes more prolonged or that gets stirred, right? And it requires, right, غلبة الظن. It requires reasonable surety, which is بأمارة, with clear signs, أو تجربة, or past experience, أو قول طبيب مسلم حاذق, or the report of a Muslim expert doctor, right, who is not outwardly corrupt. Practically, and there's a condition that's implicit, and the ulama mentioned in our time that we worry about that, which is who is informing based on their expertise in accordance with the rulings of the Sharia. Because the expectation is that an upright Muslim, when they give you their opinion, they're using their expertise to say that your situation would count as an excuse in accordance with what the ulama have said. Because the doctor is not a mufti. The ulama lay out that this is the sufficient excuse. The expert doctor, if they tell you this is, you have an excuse, on what basis is the doctor giving a fatwa? No, a doctor is giving an expert opinion that can be applied to the limits of the Sharia. In general, in our times, whether a Muslim doctor gives you an opinion or a non-Muslim doctor gives you an opinion, you have to look at that and say, okay, would this be considered a reasonable fear of sickness? You could test it with your family doctor. Say that my nose is bleeding, can I fast? What would they say? A lot of them would just say, just to be careful, just to be safe, don't do it. And what does a nosebleed have to do with the fast? Right? They don't want litigation, right? It's rare, right? One of my doctors, I asked him about fasting because I have a certain condition. He said, do you want my opinion as a medical doctor or my opinion as your fellow Muslim? I said, as a fellow Muslim. He said, you better fast. I said, as a doctor? He said, assess your situation, and if you fear anything, then it's safer medically not to fast. So I asked my family doctor, and he said absolutely not. Anyways, but you have to take their opinion and apply it. And even religious doctors, you have to get a sense, do they know the limits of the Sharia? The default is they don't, sadly. So that is sickness. Intense cold, right? And cold is intense, from which there is reasonable fear of loss of life, limb, or sickness. Discomfort alone is not an excuse. Ever have a cold shower? You're spoiled, man. Right? Like you wake up somewhere, or you need to take a shower, and in England they have these funny water heaters. Still, like, I don't know what's going on. You expect it's a developed country, right? You have to like press this lever, and it's not in the tub. It's like by the door of the washroom. I think they expect extra intelligence. You can't figure out how to turn on the water heater. So you take a cold shower. It's cold. But are you going to get sick? No, you just dry yourself, people. So you just, mild discomfort is not, so intense cold from which one fears harm or sickness. Fear of an enemy or predatory animal against oneself or one's property. Again, it has to be reasonable fear. You're out of water, say, okay, if I go to ask the neighbor, someone may shoot me. Is that likely? No. Is that reasonable fear? No. Right? And a reasonable fear would be a fear that other people would deem, upright people would deem to be a fear. Right? So what if wild dogs attack me? How many wild dogs have killed people in the GTA, in the Greater Toronto Area? Right? So fear of thirst, right? Which is when one has enough water to make tayammum, but if one to make wudu, but if one used water for wudu, one would not have enough water to drink. And they included a few things in it, some of which are mentioned in Nur al-Idah as well. Or, for fear of thirst, and that fear of thirst is for oneself, one's companions, and also one's accompanying animals, if they don't have other sources of water. Or if you need it to cook, right? Right? So for example, لعجن, to knead bread, right? أو طبخ, or to cook the food. لا لمرق, but not for sauce. Sauce is not essential unless the sauce is essential, that if you don't have the sauce, there won't be enough food for everybody, right? And that's detailed out in Nur al-Idah, right? Or from, like the fear of thirst, is if you need it to remove excessive filth, right? There's a bottle of water, you got blood all over you. So do you remove the blood or do you make wudu? Now of course, if you have other clothes, what do? Just change clothes, right? If you have Maraq al-Falah, Tahtawi mentions the issue of what if you need water for coffee? It's not an excuse, unless it would cause you a level of hardship that would be considered akin to sickness. But the asl is not an excuse, right? So we've talked about excuses for tayammum, their basis, that the details of these are found in Nur al-Idah and the Hadiyah. Sickness, right? That is يشتد أو يمتد أو يتحرك, intensified, prolonged, or stirred, that one will become sick, on the basis of غلبة الظن, of reasonable surety, of clear signs, right? Someone is obvious, when they say بأمارة, they mean بأمارة ظاهرة لا يختلف فيها عادة, that nobody, you're vomiting, and when you try to stand up you fell over, you're dizzy. Can you go and make wudu yourself? Nobody say you can, right? Of course, there's something that's sort of an understood principle in the Hanafi school that would apply here as well with respect to ability, which is that the relied upon position is the position of Imam Abu Hanifa, that المرء قادر بقدرة نفسه لا بقدرة غيره. A person is able with their own ability, not with the ability of another. And this is really important principle to be very clear about. And you should be asking yourself about this chapter to chapter. المرء قادر بقدرة نفسه لا بقدرة غيره. A person is able with their own ability, not with the ability of others. Therefore, a sick person, for example, if they can't use water themselves. Now, where's water normally found? Like someone is in hospital. Where's water typically found to make wudu? In the washroom. If they cannot get up unaided and go to the washroom unaided and make wudu unaided, they're not able. If they can get somebody to assist them, that could be good, but one has to keep in mind, and in family situations, for example, sometimes this can be a real hardship on the family member. If someone wants to get up for tahajjud at night, there's an old uncle, they came and says, Beta, and they both said, we're too old to fight with each other, but we don't know what to do. Because uncle would want to get up like 2 o'clock at night, and she's been serving him all day. He says, I also get up for tahajjud, but getting up repeatedly is very difficult. What do we do? But I don't want to say no to him. They obviously loved each other. So uncle gets up in the middle of the night. He can't, he's bedridden. He can't go. So she would take him, help him make wudu, etc., and then clean up. And he's in his 80s, she's in her late 70s. She also has her health issues. In that situation, if he wants to pray, what does he do? Tayammum. Tayammum. Right? أو فقد آلة, or lack of a tool to extract the water. This is, for example, if you are by the water, but you don't have a means of extracting the water. Now, some of the ulama mention that if you can take off your clothes without uncovering your awrah in the presence or the fear of the presence of others, then you must do that. But as we'll see with the issue of excuses coming up, with forgetfulness, sometimes knowledge would make you more responsible. Right? So if you're at a well, the water is deep down, there's no steps to go down, there's no bucket, you don't have anything. Many people wouldn't occur to them, okay, I can open my bag, I can tie a few items of clothing together, I can dip the water, the clothes in the well, take the water out, squeeze it out, and make wudu. Would you have thought of that? Right? So if in this, if you knew you could do that, and there's no excuse not to, then you would need to repeat that prayer. But if someone didn't realize that, or even forgot, because there's a kind of thing that even a person who studied it could forget, then it would be an excuse.
I have a question.
Yes.
Would it be considered hardship if that it failed and all their belongings would get wet in the process?
No, because belongings that get wet get dry. Don't we wash our clothes? I hope we do. That's a rhetorical question. That's.
If they're in a cold climate and it's not and dry.
Yeah, then that's faqd ala hukman. Right? But let's say someone's traveling, they have other clothes, whatever. So there's tafsil in that we don't have to worry about that. Okay. Then he says, so sufficient excuses required. He mentions it in brief, but systematically there are 9 conditions for the validity of tayammum. Right? He says, مستوعبا وجهه ويديه مع مرفقيه. Right? Wiping completely. One must completely wipe one's face, that which is in the definition of the face taken in wudu, and one's arms, from the tip of the fingers up to and including the elbows, with their elbows. Right? So the isti'ab is a shart, and that's the relied upon position of the madhab. Then he uses ma'a mirfaqih, with one's elbows, right? Bidarbatain. If one strikes, one must strike twice. Once for one's face, once for one's arms, right? And bidarbatain, they say أو ما يقوم مقام الضربتين, with 2 strikes, or that which takes the place of 2 strikes, which is by the dust or soil completely covering the area. Sandstorm. You fell into a sand dune and sank in fully. You made the intention. نويت التيمم لله تعالى. Right? Right? بضربتين أو ما يقوم مقام الضربتين. Right? With two strikes, or that which takes place, the place of two strikes. Right? One can, it says وَلَوْ جُنُبًا أَوْ حَائِضًا. Even if one is junub or ha'id, even if one is in major ritual impurity, janaba, or from menstruation, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made, in the absence of water, tayammum is the alternative. We use water for wudu and ghusl. When wudu would be required, one can make tayammum. When ghusl would be required, in the absence of water, one can make tayammum. And يجوز بالتيمم ما يجوز بالوضوء. And what is allowed with wudu is allowed with tayammum. عند فقد الماء, when water is absent. Right? So the complete wiping is a condition. Right? So, one strikes once, and they describe the sunnah striking, and one wipes the whole area, right? And one gets and just once, so one gets the nooks and crannies, right? What must be washed in wudu must be wiped in tayammum of the outward, right? So the thick beard, just the top surface of it, right? So wiping what reaches, right? Because it doesn't need to be any soil, as we will see, right? بطاهر من جنس الأرض. It says وإن لم يكن, right? What can we make tayammum with? He says بطاهر من جنس الأرض, with anything pure from the surface of the earth. This is a definition of the Sa'id, right? بطاهر من جنس الأرض. In the Tanweer and others, they changed طاهر to مطهر, right? Right? بطاهر, right? من جنس الأرض, with anything pure from the surface of the earth. It'd be superior to say بمطهر, right? Right? With anything pure and purifying from the surface of the earth. What does this exclude, folks? Why this مطهر من جنس الأرض?
This earth that had najasa on it and then it dry is pure to pray on, but not purifying to make tayammum from.
Good. But why is that a consideration?
Because the ayah mentions the tayammum sa'idan tayyiban.
Yeah. So?
It specifies that it has to be tayyib.
So tayyib is tahir.
Is it because it replaces water? So water is tahir and tahir, then the earth has to be the same. What would be the reason?
Yeah, but why we say what makes the soil purifying versus just pure? We're sort of in the neighborhood, right? But we want to get to Layla's house, right? There's a difference, right? Because getting to the neighborhood's awkward, right? If Majnoon is looking for Layla, it's not enough to get to the neighborhood, because you can't go around and say, does Layla live here? Because you hide, like, you want to, it's embarrassing. And this intelligent person doesn't embarrass themselves, right? So it's always important to hit the thing fully on its head, right? So here, بِطَاهِرٍ مِنْ جِنْسِ الْأَرْضِ.
Used for tayammum? Would it exclude earth that's already been used for tayammum previously? Like if you use sand and then it falls in the container, you can't use it again.
Can you, no, is that a question or a statement?
It's a question. The same way we have non.
Okay. So we can't answer a question by a question. So we'll take that. That's a good question, but so it be بِطَاهِرٍ with something pure from the category of the earth. The commentators point out that it refers to the mutahhir, that which is purifying, right? And as Khan Sahib explained, the reason for this is the ruling is that earth that was najis and became purified by drying without the use of water is tahir. So therefore, what can you do on it? You can pray on it. You can remove najasa from that earth. But you cannot use it for tayammum out of caution. Why? Because فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا, the word sa'id contains within it the meaning of pure. Why? Because that which is the surface of the earth is pure. Is there anything of the surface of the earth that in itself could be conceivably impure? So, well, a dog could, could have, defecated there. Nobody would say that the feces is sa'id. Right? Right? So, sa'id contains within it the proviso of pure. Right? So, sa'idan tayyiban. Right? Tayyib here qualifies the sa'id. And there's no tikrar in the Quran, there's no repetition. Right? So purify yourself with pure surface of the earth that is pure. Right? That is pure and purifying. So what would be excluded? Something that is not clearly, that has that borderline case. Now, can you make tayammum from the same spot multiple times, one person or multiple people? And the answer is yes. It doesn't become used. Surface does not become. So let's say 3 people or 2 people head-butted each other in a soccer game. So they're both hospitalized. Major concussion. They took 1 stone between them. They're friends. They just accidentally head-butted each other. Could they use the same stone multiple times? One person? Yes. Could strike both times on the same stone? Yes. Could use it for multiple tayammums? Yes. Could multiple people use it? Yes. It doesn't become used. Okay. We don't want to go into too much detail about that, but بِطَاهِرٍ مِنْ جِنْسِ الْأَرْضِ is a بِمُطَهِّر. And this is pointed out in the Hadiyah in summary. Some of the commentators on the Hadiyah point this out, others don't. Min jinsil ard. So this is a definition. Tahir min jinsil ard or mutahhir min jinsil ard is it what is sa'id, right? Sa'idan tayyiba. Wa illam yakun alayhi naqa. Even if there is no dust upon it. Right? Even if there is no dust on it. Why? Because the condition is that it be top surface. Not everything on the top surface is Sa'id is ghubar, right? Dust. Right? Right? وَبِهِ أي وَبِالنَّقَى بِلَا عُذْر. And it's permitted with dust, meaning dust alone, even without inability to use soil, meaning that which is of the surface of the earth. Why? Because Imam Abu Yusuf said that the basis is that you use soil, turab. You can only use dust alone in the absence of soil. So he's pointing to the khilaf of Abu Yusuf here. So it's a point of caution. When you can comfortably use soil itself, right? Sand, earth, right? Rather than just a stone, that would be better because it avoids the difference opinion of Imam Abu Yusuf, avoids the difference opinion of Imam al-Shafi'i. But practically, the Shafi'is and others take our dispensation because, practically, can you take soil into a hospital? And there are places they do. There's some Muslim countries where they, especially with Shafi'i predominant countries, they give patients, you could request, like a tray of soil. And then the poor guys have to clean it up. Right? And some places where you have some staunch medical staff, they'll say, you can't do that. Right? Because they'll be attitudinally divergent with you in the hospital. Say, really? And there, one of the practice, if you're Indian, in the Middle East, you want to be ignored, just say, Ana Hindi. Just say, I'm Indian. Say, poor guy, just leave him alone, miskin. Right? If you tell them, I'm Canadian, I'm American, Once I was annoyed because the third taxi I was taking in Amman, I said, just focus on getting to Jannah. But the religious guy said, how do I go to Canada? I was preparing for my dars. This folk says, I want to go to Jannah, but through Canada. And you can sympathize because it's very difficult circumstances. But anyways, so here, even if there's no dust on it, right, and you can use something, so something from the surface of the earth, like a stone, it does not have to have dust. Right? You can use dust on its own even without soil. You can make tayammum on the back of a dog. How? If you were to strike the dog, of course you can't hit the dog hard because that's wronging the dog. Right? Is the skin or hair of the dog najis? No. In our madhab it isn't. There's better things, but the only thing you have, you're locked up in a najis prison cell with a dog. The dog's dirty. It has dust on it. It's okay. You can make, theoretically, or on dirty furniture. The condition is that the dust would be manifest on your hand. But some people say, well, if you look in the sunlight, you can see particles of dust in the air. You can't wave your hands in the air and make dust unless there's so much dust that when you look at your hands from a normal distance, most of your hand, more than 3 fingers, are covered with dust. Okay. It's extrinsically recommended to avoid difference of opinion if it doesn't lead to do something disliked in our madhab. Then he says, nawiyan, with intention. So intention is a condition because of the meaning of tayammum. Okay, because of the meaning of tayammum, which comes from qasd. Right? And it has a double sense of qasd. Right? So it's not just from the fa'ala pattern, but it's from the tafa'ala pattern. So intention is required. Given that intention is required, فَلَغَى تَيَمُّمُ كَافِرٍ لَا وُضُوءُهُ. Therefore, the tayammum of a disbeliever would not be valid. But not their wudu. Right? So they did not require ghusl. Right? So someone non-Muslim, they're saying, let me find about Islam, but they decide to take a shower. They came to the masjid, but they'd passed wind. So out of respect for the Muslims, I'll also do this wuzu thing. Okay, so they did that. Then they sat with the Imam, and the Imam convinced them about belief in God. Their wudu would be valid. But they were on a journey, and they got convinced about Islam. Their tayammum before Iman would not be valid. And these things happen, right? These things happen. Like, it's not. You went camping with some non-Muslims. I have a friend who every year would do an interfaith retreat in the countryside on reflecting on the names of God. Every year, at least one or two people would become Muslim, like interfaith leaders. Because we know more. Allah has, Imam Abu Hafs al-Nasafi in the Tafsir mentions, one of the things Allah has blessed us with, He has told us more about Himself in the Quran than in any other previous revelation. Right? فَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى. How many names of God could a Christian list that are mentioned explicitly in the Bible? Right? How many can be mentioned in the Jewish tradition and others? Right? Of God Himself. Right? Anyways. So tayammum, وَلَا تَنْقُضُهُ رِدَّةً, and apostasy does not invalidate it. Right? And that line is missing from my thing. Right? So then, what does invalidate tayammum? Let's look at that next. What does invalidate tayammum? He says, بَلْ نَاقِضُ الْأَصْلِ. Right? Or بل ناقض الأصل or ناقض الوضوء. Rather, it is invalidated by what invalidates wudu. Right? Tayammum is invalidated, number one, by everything that invalidates wudu. So someone made tayammum and they passed wind, blood came out, etc., they need to make another tayammum. Number two, وَقُدْرَةُ مَاءٍ فَضَلَ عَنْ حَاجَتِهِ. Secondly, the ability to use water that is surplus of their need. فَهِيَ تَمْنَعُ التَّيَمُّمَ وَتَرْفَعُهُ. So the ability, so this qudra, this ability prevents tayammum and invalidates tayammum. The ability to use water, surplus of their need, because al-mashghul bil-haj, they say al-mashghul bil-haja kal-ma'dum hukman. The water that is busy with more pressing needs is as if not present. Right? Right? The ability to use water. Either the water comes or the inability goes. Right? Meaning, so فهي تمنع التيمم. Abu Saud puts it really nicely. أي القدرة المذكورة, this ability to use water, تمنع إباحة التيمم, prevents the permissibility of tayammum ابتداءً. If you have the ability to use water, you can make tayammum. وترفعه بقاءً, and it lifts the validity of tayammum on an ongoing basis. Now, within this kind of terse statement there's implicitly another invalidator. That's very important. It's mentioned in Nur al-Idah and elsewhere, which is, it's one listed amongst the conditions of wudu, of conditions for the validity of tayammum, both in Nur al-Idah and also in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah, which is, which one is it? And it's subsumed in the statement of Imam al-Nasafi here, which is زوال العذر المبيح وينقضه أيضا زوال ما أباح التيمم. The tayammum is also invalidated by the end of the excuse that permitted tayammum. That's very important. Let's say someone is sick, right? So let's say we live in Zainabad, right? Right? So Zain became a wealthy landowner in rural Punjab, and so they really like him. He's a very good landowner. So they renamed the village Zainabad. He did some fiqh experiments on the local well. So, because an animal died in it, so they removed all the water, and they're out of water. So what happens? They decide, so they made tayammum due to because of lack of water. But then they went looking for water, and Zayn's companion got sick. But then they found water. Right? So initially they made tayammum due to absence of water. While the water was absent, a second excuse occurred, which was sickness. When they found water, what happens to the tayammum? There is an excuse, which is sickness, because they found water, but ينقضه أيضا زوال ما أباح التيمم. The end of what permitted tayammum, when that finishes, because the tayammum was built on a particular inability. When that inability goes, the tayammum is invalidated. وَلَوْ وُجِدَ عُذْرٌ آخر. Even if there's another excuse. So they didn't have water, so they went looking for water. Someone got sick. They found water. Tayammum is invalidated. Now the one who has a second excuse can make tayammum because of the second excuse. But, so, excuse A made tayammum. There's excuse B. Excuse A ends, tayammum ends. Excuse B remains, you can make tayammum again. You must make tayammum again. Right, so that's important. ينقضه أيضا. Tayammum is also invalidated by the end of what permitted tayammum. And that's implicitly understood by the way Imam al-Nasafi expressed this, right? But it's an ishara khafifa. Anyways, the commentators mention it's better to just mention it explicitly, and you can find that in the Durr and the Hashia. Okay. Now, what about hope of finding water? He says, "راجي الماء يؤخر الصلاة." The issue of hoping to find water, Imam al-Nasafi abbreviates the discussion significantly. Partly because a lot of the tafri'ah of it, the derived rulings, are from the derivations of the Mashayikh. The asl of Zahir al-Riwayah, there's not a lot of detail on it. Right? One hopeful of finding water delays the prayer. Now, the one hoping for water delays their prayers. Right? And this is with strong hope, raja'an qawiyan, as mentioned in the Durr al-Mukhtar. Ibn Abdin explains that what's meant there by al-raja' al-qawi is ghalabat al-dhann, with reasonable surety. Right? Now, Imam al-Nasafi left it in this way deliberately. Why? Because a treasure chest of subtleties, right? Rajil ma. How strong does that raja have to be? There's ikhtilaf about. But the basis is that it's ghalabat al-dhann, reasonable surety. You're reasonably sure that you'll find water. So what's the scenario? We're walking to the next village. The next village is still 2 miles away. It's Dhuhr time, right? I'm feeling tired. I don't know, like, what's going to happen when we reach that village. Time's in. There's a quiet, peaceful corner. Now, I'm hopeful to find water. I'm reasonably sure. What, do people live in a place where there's no water? No. So that's why there's khilaf in the madhab, right? Right? That this ta'khir, this delay, is it required or recommended? Because right now, do I have water? Right? Or practically, I'm on a plane. There's no water on the plane. I lost my wudu. We're landing in London Heathrow Airport in 40 minutes. Dhuhr time's in. There's still 3 hours. Now, do I have to wait till I make wudu at the airport and pray there? There's one opinion that's yajib at-ta'khir. You must delay. The other is recommended. Why? Because ability is at this moment, and am I able at this moment? I'm obligated to pray. At-taklif biqadri al-wus'a. Moral responsibility is to the extent of ability. At this moment, am I able? Lam tajidu ma'an. You did not find water. So that's why here, implicit, there's a few khilafs. Hope for finding water. How strong does the hope has to be? With reasonable surety, right? Yeah, at the airport, I know I can find water there. Delays their prayer, right? Delays wujuban or istihbaban. Is it necessary to delay the prayer till there, or recommended? What's the end point of the delay? The end point of the delay is ila akhir al-waqt al-mustahab, right? Till the end of the recommended time. La ila waqt al-karaha, not to the highly disliked time. Is this delay required or recommended? What was chosen in the Durr al-Mukhtar is nadban. It's recommended. The delay, the one hoping for water before the disliked time delays their prayer, this is recommended to do. And there's an opinion that is wajib to do. So you have to be cautious. So we're on the journey, right? We stopped at this nice place. There's a few trees. There's no water though. In an hour's time, you will get to the hotel because our car broke down. We're walking there. But I'm like, I don't like walking. Once I get to the hotel, I'm just going to crash. Right? There are two opinions. So the one hoping for water delays their prayer. Hoping with reasonable surety delays their prayer till before it reaches the disliked time. This delay is either recommended, which is a relied upon position, or wajib. And there's ikhtilaf on this. Now, we took the principle that tayammum is a complete substitute. In the absence of water, tayammum is tahara. Therefore, there are implications. Right? بناء على كونه بدلا مطلقا. Right? So he says, وصح قبل الوقت. Tayammum is valid before its time. Right? وَلِفَرْضَيْن, and for more than one fard prayer or more, right? Right? And as many wajib or nafil prayers one wishes, ada'an aw qada'an, in current performance or makeup. So nicely summarized in ta'i, right? But there's khilaf of Imam al-Shafi'i, right? And it's built on the fact that in our madhab, the tahara of tayammum in the absence of water is mutlaqa, right? Right? That the hadath is lifted until the excuse ends or any of the nullifiers take place. But if one wants to avoid the difference between the Shafi'is, avoiding difference can be recommended. وَخَوْفِ صَلَاةِ جَنَازَةٍ أَوْ عِيد. Right? Or if you fear to miss Salat al-Janaza or Salat al-Eid. It says, لِكُلِّ صَلَاةٍ تَفُوتْ لَا إِلَى خَلَفٍ. For any prayer that would be missed without it having a substitute. Right? Because if you miss Janaza, can you pray another Janaza? No. And this is وَلَوْ بِنَاءً, even if you're building upon it. So you said Allahu Akbar for Salat al-Janaza and you lost your wudu. Right? If you went and made wudu, and this is even in the presence of water. If you went and made wudu, would the Salat al-Janaza still be going on? No. So let's say they have stone pillars. That's why some old masajid, they didn't used to paint their pillars. Why? You could technically you could make tayammum on the pillar. They wouldn't teach people to do it because people would do things wrong, but you go, make tayammum, you join in, and you finish your Salat al-Janaza. Or Salat al-Eid. The asl is Salat al-Eid will be performed once. Right? If Salat al-Eid is missed, what do? You don't do Salat al-Eid on your own, etc., etc. So, but لا لفوت جمعة. Not if you fear missing Jum'ah. Why? Because what is the alternative for Jum'ah? Dhuhr. Right? It may be sinful without excuse, but it has an alternative. It has a substitute. Right? And not for the current prayer, because the ada has an alternative which is qada. So someone wakes up at the end of Fajr time, there's 1 minute left. Would tayammum be valid there? No. Right? Rather, they would make wudu and pray once the sun has risen. Because you have water. Imam Zufar disagreed. He said, you don't have the ability there to use water. Some of the later scholars said that you can take the position of Imam Zufar لحرمة الوقت مع وجوب الإعادة أو مع وجوب القضاء, more precisely. Some of the later scholars recommended that, it is mentioned in Hashit ibn Abdin, that you right? If there's not enough time to make wudu and pray within the time, they said you can take the position of Imam Zufar for the sake of the sanctity of the time, make tayammum, pray, but And you have hope because he is a mujtahid. But it will be required to make qada. Because that's not a reliable position in the madhab. This, and they mentioned that that's caution. It's recommended. Is it required to take that opinion? No. Right? But the aspect of caution is there. But the caution is in taking it out of respect of the time, but the caution entails that you still have to do qada, because you would have done qada anyways. So the qada is required. We just take the position of Imam Zufar out of the caution of respecting that time. Okay. Right, and this mentioned by Imam Ibrahim al-Halabi, right? As quoted in the Durr al-Mukhtar, and Ibn Abdin says, ينبغي العمل به احتياطا. One acts upon this out of caution. It's ينبغي, it's encouraged to act upon this out of caution. Now one makes tayammum and prays within the time, in the scenario where there's not enough time. But then one must repeat it, which one would have done anyways. But you cannot give fatwa on these kinds of riwayat, just bit tashahi. Right? Especially other than the position of Abu Yusuf and Muhammad. But there are a whole number of treatises. Imam Abu Bakr al-Mullah has a treatise on it. Sidi Abdul Ghani Nawulsi has, on the issues in which the fatwa is on the opinion of Imam Zufar. Okay. That's the issue of right. You can also make tayammum in the situations where wudu is not required, but wudu would be better. How? Do you have to have wudu to sit in the masjid? Do you have to have wudu to attend the dars? So the dars is about to start. You sat down and you lost your wudu. Right? You saw some other students plump down on the ground. You plump down, put your wudu, went as well. Now, for you to go make wudu and come back, you'd be late for class. So in that situation, so you're not going to be praying with this wudu. You could make wudu there, make tayammum there. Because you need just as an expression of being, because it's a surah al-tahara, if you don't have haqiqat al-tahara. It's really cold. You're having trouble sleeping. You made wudu once, lay down in bed, lost your wudu. Made wudu again, went to bed, lost your wudu. Every time you're making wudu, you're feeling more awake. You prayed 2 rak'ahs, lost your wudu. Right? You want to go to sleep in tahara, you can make tayammum. But this should not be an excuse not to make tayammum in those cases. So these things like this, you say this kind of subtle caution is not taught to the common person, because they'll get confused. They'll misuse it. And then he says, وَلَمْ يُعِدْ إِنْ صَلَّ بِهِ وَنَسِيَ الْمَاءَ فِي رَحْلِهِ. One who prays with tayammum, having forgotten water in their belongings, does not have to repeat. Right? You can look in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyya and elsewhere for the detail of this. Right? That this is in kana mimma yunsa adatan. If the water is in the rahl is in your, where you keep your belongings, in your mount or in your mode of transportation, right? But it's more general than that, whether in the city or outside, right? That if you forgot the water, in a place where normally you wouldn't expect the water to be. So if you're in a car and your car broke down, says, I don't have any water, but there's water in the, where you keep the water, what's it called? The cup holder. Is that an excuse? No, because would anyone not look? Like, where would you look for water in your car? Right? The water holder. Yeah, there's a few water holders. You would look there. Or you check your trunk. Is there water in the trunk? If you normally keep water in the trunk. Some people do. Right? But if it's in a place where you would normally not expect water to be, under the seat, for example, right? Right? Between the seats, things like that, then, so that's where one who prays with tayammum having forgotten water in their belongings, and it's in a place where you wouldn't expect it. You're hiking. You normally keep your water on the side pocket. But you forgot that you had like a water flask in your belongings. Now, people normally put their water in the bag itself? Typically not, because it could spill. But you put it in the bag, so you forgot that was in the bag, that's excusable. Right? So it goes back to, would it be forgotten there adatan? Right? Now, وَيَطْلُبُهُ غَلْوَةً إِنْ ظَنَّ قُرْبَهُ. One must look for the water to the extent of a ghalwa, right? Which is one's immediate vicinity, right? If one thinks, one has done that it is close, right? يَطْلُبُهُ, one seeks water, wujuban. It is wajib to look for water if in dhanna, right? One looks for water, it's wajib to look for water if one has dhann, i.e. dhann ghalib, if one is reasonably sure that it's close. That it's close meaning within a mile. How would you think it's close to a mile? Either by clear signs. What's the basis of dhann? Generally three things. أمارة أو تجربة أو إخبار ثقة. Right? Clear signs, past experience, or trustworthy report. But if you think the water is close, you don't have to actually go a mile. What do you have to do? Because that's hardship. You only have to look for it in your immediate vicinity. The taqdir bil ghalwa, the ghalwa, they said, is it 300 ذراع إلى 400, 300 to 400 ذراع, so 150 to 200 meters. There's lots of khilaf. The hasil of the madhab is that it's 300 dhira, about 150 meters in each direction. But in each direction that one hopes for water. Right? So there's a rock cliff to your right. Do you have to look in the rock cliff? No. In any direction that you think the water would be. There's no water there. And then you don't have to actually walk the distance. It's enough to look. Right? في أي جهة ظن يعني وجود الماء, in any direction in which you would think the water would be there. So you just came from that way. There's no water behind you. You're sure. You're reasonably sure there's no water behind you. You don't have to go backwards and look. The right, there's a rock cliff. You don't need to. You're traveling in the mountain. Do you have to jump off the cliff to look for water? No. So you just have to look ahead of you. Right? Now, looking for water is only required conditionally, is only wajib conditionally for the traveler. By traveler, they mean man kana kharij al-umran, someone who's outside city limits. Generally. Because in the general case, within city limits, لا يصدق عادة, one is normally not believed that there's no water within a mile. Because in inhabited area, do humans normally live in a place? In a normal condition. There could be in a drought, in a drought, then it's like being in the countryside. But the general case, would you believe someone said, today there's no water in any of Brampton? لا. Right? They say, يعني كل دعوة تخالف الظاهر فلا بد لها من دليل بين. Any claim that goes against what is apparently obvious requires clear evidence. Right? لا يصدق. Like nobody would accept that, right? Oh, there's no water in Karachi today. Yeah, okay, there's no water running from the taps, but nobody has water? Right? That's hard to believe. Allah. وَإِلَّا لَا. And otherwise, not. Otherwise, meaning if one is not reasonably sure, إِلَّمْ يَغْلِبْ عَلَى ظَنِّهِ قُرْبَهُ. If one does not think, one is not reasonably sure that the water is close, then one does not need to search for it. But if one has some hope, if you have غَلَبَةِ الظَّنِّ that the water is within a mile, it's wajib to look for it in your immediate vicinity, not beyond. If you're not reasonably sure that there's water within a mile, it's recommended to look for it, but not required. It's recommended to search more than the ghalwa, but not required. Because practically, let's say you're traveling, your car broke down. Going, 150 meters away from the car is not a hardship. But imagine on a hot day, you go half a kilometer away from the car, then you have to walk back. And if you don't have water, you're going to be thirsty. Right? So that's why this is rahmah. And of course, there's athar from which this is established. Now, the next issue, there is an apparent ikhtilaf in the madhab. Right? That do you need to ask other people for it? So in some texts there's an apparent khilaf that is mentioned. And that's why knowing the riwayat of the madhab, etc. is important. Which is, that do you have to go ask people for water? Do you have to ask your neighbors for water? Do you have to ask your companions for water? So it's related from Abu Hanifa, that's disgraceful. Right? Because لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have honored the human. So asking is, negating that karama, that honor. Sahabain said you have to ask. Because al-ma' mabdhulun adat. Because people normally give water. So, but Imam al-Jassas and others made tawfiq, right? That one, and this is what the Kanz resolves this very clearly, that one must ask. يَطْلُبُهُ مِنْ رَفِيقِهِ. One يَطْلُبُهُ وُجُوبًا. It is necessary to seek it from one's companion, right? One companion is one who's with one. This is on a journey. Or like a neighbor, the same thing would apply in a city, right? Right? And of course, the condition is you only have to ask it from people who have water. You don't have to go ask, I don't have water, you don't have, would you give me water? Of course, you don't ask from someone who doesn't have it. That's obvious. The exception is, إِلَّا إِلَى غَلَبَ عَلَى ظَنِّهِ مَنْعَهُ. Unless one is reasonably sure that they won't give it, or they would mind being asked. يعني كما لو كان في موضع يعز فيه الماء, such as if you're in a place where there's not enough water. And this applies in some cities. In Amman, for example, when I was there, and I think the case has only gotten worse, there'll only be running water in once a week. The rest of the week, like from the mains, then the tank of water would be filled. So if you're on the day before the water comes, everybody's low on water, typically. So all your neighbors have large families. They're like being really careful about their water. And you don't have to ask, right? So if you don't think they'll give it to you, if you are reasonably sure that they won't give it to you, then you don't have to ask, right? And that's how the khilaf between Abu Hanifa and the Sahibin is lifted. That he said you must ask when you think they'll give it. When you're reasonably sure they won't, then you don't have to ask, because then it's humiliating yourself. So it's not an actual khilaf in this case. فَإِن مَنَعَهُ, if they prevent you, either explicitly or by indication, then one makes tayammum. They either prevent it or they use it up. You cannot take someone else's water without their permission, even if you need it for tayammum. What if you need it for drinking? There's fiqh. If there's two of you traveling, your companion has a lot of water, you're thirsty. So slight thirst, you can't take it. Strong thirst, you can't take it. What if you're going to die? They won't give you water. What do? Right? So their preservation of life is given precedence over preservation of wealth. You could take it from them, but can you harm them for it? And then that takes us way outside the limits, right? Then one makes tayammum. If they وَإِن لَمْ يُعْطِهِ إِلَّا بِثَمَنِ مِثْلِهِ, if they only give it for the market price, the thaman al-mithl, right? The market price, then, and you have the money, وَلَهُ ثَمَنُهُ, and one has the price, لَا يَتَيَمَّمْ, one cannot make tayammum, but rather one must buy the water. وَإِلَّا تَيَمَّمْ, otherwise, meaning if they give it for more than market price, or if one doesn't have that, because one needs it for one's hawaj, like one has a tight budget, then one makes tayammum. Now, ثَمَنِ الْمِثْل أو بغبن يسير, or with a slight markup, right? With a slight markup, right? Because let's say, you need to buy a bottle, a couple of bottles of water. The market price, right? You're getting it from a supermarket. A normal, is cheaper than a convenience store. A convenience store is cheaper than like a gas station, right? That's all within the market price. Someone said that's all within the market price, but someone marks it up slightly, which is the kind of markup that most people would consider acceptable, right? They said, is it more than 50%? Is it twice the price? They would say that returns to custom. And you have it above and beyond your immediate needs, right? Then you can make tayammum. and the market price is considered in that place. Because let's say you come from a place where water is cheap, you go to a place where water is expensive. No, we don't pay that kind of price. No, because the aada and the urf is considered of where you are. Right? Otherwise, you make tayammum. Right? Another opinion is that the excessive markup is if it's twice the market rate. Right? And there's a bunch of aqwal about that. In itself, is that which would be considered an excessive markup. Now, just as an interesting side, if you're thirsty and there's no water except by buying it, then it is obligatory for you to pay for the water, even if it's a ridiculous price. Let's say someone's stingy. So Scrooge became Muslim. Right? Right? So Abdullah Scrooge. Right? Or Scrooge's son became Muslim. Right? But he was born before Scrooge repented from his miserliness. So Abdullah ibn Scrooge, right, is going to die of thirst. So Uncle Bilal will sell him water, but at a 3 times markup. He said, I will never pay for it. This money is hard earned and it's for my inheritors. If he dies as if you have killed yourself. Because you had the money, and preservation of life is given precedence over preservation of wealth. Right? Right? Otherwise they make tayammum. Now, if لو أكثره جريحا, right? There's one last issue, which is if most of your body is wounded, then you make tayammum. Right? And for wudu, this is considered by the number of limbs, and for ghusl, this is considered by the masahat al-badan, by the extent of the body. Nasallallahu al-afiyah. One is wounded, and by wounded meaning it's such that يضره استعمال الماء, one will be harmed by the use of water, based on ghalib al-dhann, the same 3 criteria. If most of the body is wounded, then one makes tayammum. If only some limbs are wounded, then one makes wudu. And if the wound is such that you can wipe over it, you wipe over it. Like so, you burnt your arms, right? You burnt both arms. Nasallallahu al-afiyah. Right? You got this oven, to make stone, like wood burning pizzas. You realize how quick. Then you heard this. Keep it for 90 seconds. You forgot where the thing to insert it in is, so you put your arms in the oven. You burnt your arms. Now you have to make wudu. So, what happens if you can't wash them? So there's only 2 limbs, but you can still wash your face, wipe your head, wash your feet. So if you can wipe over if you can't wash the area, you wipe it. If you can't wipe it, it's excused. Right? And the wudu would be valid. But you cannot join وَلَا يُجْمَعُ بَيْنَهُمَا. Right? If you cannot join between tayammum and ghusl. In our madhab, because there's no basis in the sharia for joining between the original legislation, the asl, and the badal, and the substitute in one action. خلافاً للشافعية, contrary to the Shafi'is, the Hanafis explain those texts and they're dhanni. So where do you get them from? There are other interpretations for it. Right? So that's the section on tayammum. next week we're going to look at wiping over footgear and beyond. بإذن الله تعالى وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. We encouraged that you look at the Nur al-Idah, if that's accessible, and that's translated into English. If not, and if you can access the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah, we should put the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah as a resource with the Ta'liqat al-Mardiyah of Shaykh al-Burhani. Any questions before we close?
So Shaykh, just look. No, Shaykh is on it.
Just go ahead.
Just wanted clarification when you said la wala yajma'u baynahuma. So does that mean
in one act, in one action, you cannot join between wudu and tayammum? Because in some madhabs, what one would do is, there's a way, and there are hadiths about it. It's an ijtihadi matter. You would wash what you can, then make tayammum, and then continue washing what you can. Because based on the base of the Shafi'is take the position that tayammum is a badal darura, number one. Number two, because of certain texts, and that's dealt with in the works of khilaf. How do we understand those texts? And the Hanafis basically understand the dhanni in light of the qat'i. And things that establish exceptional rulings, the Hanafis deem the exceptions exceptional. Unless they're undeniable, unless it's so clearly established that it's, we don't deny what's evident. So any other questions?
Can someone who's junub but makes tayammum so as to catch the Eid prayer recite Quran on the way to the Musalla?
Of course. No, hold on. One's junub. That's a smart question. I don't know the answer. It's a good question. I'm sure if one digs, one can find the answer, but things like that require nas. In the absence of that, the practical thing is, one doesn't give oneself a fatwa, but وبينهما أمور مشتبهات لا يعلمهن كثير من الناس فمن اتقى الشبهات فقد استبرأ لدينه وعرضه. That the halal is clear and the haram is clear. Between them are matters that are unclear. Practically, the operational, there's a theoretical definition of the mushtabih, right, with respect to the mujtahid, the faqih, etc. But for the morally responsible person, the mushtabih is the baseline mushtabih, the unclear, is that which you do not know the ruling of Allah about with reasonable surety. That's mushtabih. When you don't know the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based on, because clearly known, or because of your knowledge of it, or because of asking, right? Then, asking someone reliable, then the sunnah is فَمَنِ اتَّقَى الشُّبُهَاتِ, the one who keeps away from unclear matters, safeguards their religion and their honor. And whoever keeps falling into the unclear will inevitably fall into the haram. So that's the thing. So if one doesn't know in things like that, that is where caution would be required. Now you don't just give yourself a fatwa that is haram, say I don't know. Therefore one desists. One thing that helps in that is to see what is the asl in this. when the asl is permissibility, then it's permissible. But here the asl is that someone's junub, they don't know, so then the caution is evident. But it's far-fetched in the city that if something like that happens, usually, like especially if the masjid is far away, it's okay. So it'll take you 10 minutes to get there, but you can't make wudu. The other thing that لا يصدق, and that's where a talib ilm should never have this kind of issue. Why? A talib ilm who cannot make wudu in 25 to 30 seconds is not a talib ilm. So what's the point of learning what's fard and sunnah, unless when you need you can do the fard. The fard can be done in 20 seconds. Wash face once, one arm, two arm, wipe head, wash both feet, khalas. That's not much longer than tayammum. So practically لا يصدق. That going from home with tayammum, that's pretty far-fetched. Right? Any other questions before we close?
Sayyidi, just going off of what we covered earlier in the class, that the Imam said that that you are only held accountable, or what's considered is your own ability. On the part where we talked about وراجل ما يؤخر الصلاة, in the commentary, the
Which commentary?
of Mullah Miskin,
Okay.
he mentions that the Imam said وعن أبي حنيفة وأبي يوسف في غير رواية الأصول أن التأخير واجب. So first, what is غير رواية الأصول?
رواية الأصول is ظاهر الرواية.
So then, considering the principle that one is only held accountable by his own ability, could you shed some light on this?
On what? No, we can't say this. Like, what are you asking about?
The fact that Imam Abu Hanifa's his position was that ta'khir is wajib.
No,
But
it's not. وعن أبي حنيفة, right? عند indicates the madhab of someone's position. عنه, it's related from him. This عنه indicates a narration. Frequently it indicates that this is not their madhab. Right? عند generally indicates a madhab, but one always needs to confirm. عن indicates an opinion. Therefore, here, that's why the first part of the ibarah, وَرَاجِ الْمَاء يُؤَخِّرُ الصَّلَاةِ, the one who hopes for water delays the prayer. Even Mullah Miskin, rahimahullah, says, أي يُسْتَحَبُّ لِعَادِمِ الْمَاءِ, it's recommended for the one who doesn't have water. وَهُوَ يَرْجُوهُ, and they're hopeful for it. أن يؤخر الصلاة إلى آخر الوقت, to the end of the time. بحيث لا يقع في الوقت المكروه, such that it doesn't fall into the makruh time. So this is, Mullah Miskin is not talking off the top of his head. He's explaining the madhab, right? And in subtlety. So that's what we said. What's also mentioned in the Dur, that this ta'khir is mustahab. This delay is recommended for the reason we mentioned. So that's the relied upon position. وعن أبي حنيفة وأبي يوسف في غير رواية الأصول. This is in another narration. And if there's ta'arud between, firstly, he already made taqreer of the method. And this is mentioned in other than رواية الأصول في غير ظاهر الرواية, that this ta'khir is wajib. Why is this mentioned? Out of caution. Out of caution. But caution, they can be different i'tibars, right? When I used to travel with, often with Shaykh Yahya, now both of us hardly travel. If you're on the plane, I tell him, we're going to land somewhere and Maghrib's in. I say, Sidi, it's planes in descent, please pray right now. With head movements? I said, what, like on a flying carpet? Because my idea was, look, time is in, you have wudu, pray. Once you get on the ground, like on an airport, for example, because sometimes you have to line up even to get, takes time to disembark, etc. But now once the plane's on the ground, it's very questionable. Then being able to pray sitting is very questionable. And I hate to say it, I was generally right. He's being more cautious, but sometimes caution is less cautious. I prayed, we got to, I was like, Sayyidi, so when are you going to be praying? And there's no place to pray, right? Because they're herding you in, it's taking time to disembark, this and that. So that's where, but in itself, all else being equal, were you to delay, in itself, it's caution, that's why it's mentioned. So, an indicates a narration. غير رواية الأصول is ظاهر الرواية, right? Right?
Also, then what about asking one's friend for water? Could one not do that? Because according to the Imam, the principle is that you wouldn't have to ask other people.
No. That's two separate things. You're able with your own ability, so you don't have the ability to make water appear. But do you have the ability to ask? Yes. Do you have the ability to buy? Yes. The only inability is, effectively, you don't have to disgrace yourself. Right? You don't have to humiliate yourself, right? But that's where there is a haya shar'i and there's a haya tabi'i. Right? And what's mu'tabar is haya shar'i. That shyness, based on the standards of Sharia, that this would reasonably be considered humiliating yourself. Right? Just feeling awkward is not a thing, right? So it's a separate issue. It's good to ask these questions though. Any other questions? Any questions online? Yeah.
Isn't the definition mutlaq in al a circular definition, as mutlaq is already that which can purify, so it's like saying you can purify using that which can purify.
No. You can use for tayammum that which shar'an would be considered mutahhir. Because the ulama, when they looked at soil is tahir. But there is a type of soil whose tahara is da'ifa. Because the asl in tahara is al-ma'. Right? So there's a tahara that is affirmed for the ground بذهاب الأثر دون استعمال الماء. Right? When the traces go without water. But there's a weak tahara in it, right? Because, and the shuruh explain out why, and we'll see that, we'll unpack that a little bit when we look at the najasat, right? That one of the ways of tahara from najasa is, bil jafaf, with drying, right? And we'll see the rulings there. The section on najasat in Nur al-Idah is very good. He really rounds it out. But there's excellent work on this issue of najasat. Just so I don't forget, you could make a placeholder there. It's really nicely discussed by Imam Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi in his work Naf'u al-Mufti was-Sa'il, which is published in Arabic as Fatawa al-Laknawi. Now just be aware that there's Naf'u al-Mufti was-Sa'il itself, Fatawa al-Laknawi, And Dr. Salah, Hafidhahullah, did an abridgment of it. Refer to the original. Right? The abridgment's useful, but there's no need, really. I mean, the original work has different curious masail and this and that and the other, but he does a really nice discussion on the wasail of tahara. Okay, and we'll be coming to that. Now, one thing that the author left, and if you didn't pay attention to that, again, I'm not trying to pick on you guys, but you should be aware that there are sunan of tayammum. If you didn't realize that the author did not mention sunan, then you should make tawbah, because you don't have to make tawbah only from sin, but also from shortcomings, and this is clearly a shortcoming in talib al-ilm. The talib al-ilm, the ism fa'il, is the one who's actively characterized by talab. So active talab is, being active is contrary to being passive. So just prepared, but you didn't pay enough attention. What are there sunan, right? And these are mentioned in the Hadiyah al-Ala'iyah. Some are sunan mu'akkada, there's some sunan mustahabba. Wa sunanuhu, right? At-tasmiyah fi awwalihi, making the tasmiyah in its beginning. Wat-tartib, and observing the order. Face first, then the arms. Wal-muwala, to do it consecutively. Wad-darb bi-batini kaffayhi wa zahiriha. So strike the inside of the hand, this is sunnah mu'akkada. Wa batiniha as well, right? Both sides on the ground. And a lot of people don't realize this. Wa iqbaluha wa idbaruha. You hit the ground. Iqbal, idbar. You put the hand front, back. Wa nafduhuma. But if it's on soil, you hit the hands against each other to rid yourself of excessive soil, because getting unnecessary amount of soil onto yourself, where avoidable, is blameworthy, because it's muthla. That's been castigated in the Sharia. Right? Hit the hands on the side. Nafduhuma. When you place your hands on the ground, tafrijul asabi', keeping the hands open, it's recommended. And tayamun, you're doing the right hand before the left. And some of these are recommended. So there's, I think, 8 or 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 or 9. Some of these are recommended. Generally mentioned 4 that are emphasized sunnahs: tasmiyah, tartib, muwala, and darb with the inside of the hands. Yes.
Why does Nasafi rahimahullah mention them? Like, can you?
Because he's very smart. No idea. Right? They speculated. One is to point to the fact that because these so one of the arguments that the Shurrah make, it's an intriguing thing. Right? So in my notes, I quoted these from the Hadith, but one of the arguments is that يراعى في البدل ما يراعى في الأصل. Right? So tasmiyah, tartib, muwala, saying the basmala, observing order, doing it consecutively, are understood from wudu, right? Right? And then, if you're going to strike the ground, what are you going to strike the ground with? With what you'll use, right? Because if you strike the back of your hand, what are you going to do with the back of your hand, right? Like, imagine wiping your face with the back of your hand. You're going to strike with, so it's, it's evident, so it doesn't need to be mentioned. But that's why it's Kanz al-Daqa'iq, right? But you have to live Kanz al-Daqa'iq in the sense that you have to notice what he says, but also notice what he doesn't say. Notice what he mentions unconditionally, and notice what he conditions. right? That's why the very capable young faqih in Karachi that I met, he was teaching Kanz al-Daqa'iq. It's Mufti. And he felt, he wanted to do a lot of things. He's young and very energetic. Quite impressive. His teacher told him, and he felt like, Kanz al-Daqa'iq straightforward, because he graduated a few years ago, he'd done Sharh al-Wiqaya and Hidayah and Ifta and these books. Like, Kanz al-Daqa'iq is easy. His teacher told him, his teacher only allowed him to teach 2 texts, 2 books. Says, and prepare for it. And his teacher, the first year he's teaching it, says, okay, I want to see how you're teaching it. And the mashayikh do this. Not just to give them a hard time, but so that people give it its haqq, so they don't become lazy, but also to help coach them in how they teach. And he thought it would be easy. Because he said, I'd studied the Kanz, I'd studied the books after it. And he said, and I had done mutala'a. But every year when he teaches it, it's like it's a brand new experience. Oh my goodness. There are ajaib in the Kanz. Right? And it's, but also part of the reason, this is part of the training, which is al-fiqhu fahmu ma daqqa min al-umur. Fiqh is to understand subtleties. Right? Why is these subtleties important? Because this is the nature of the khitab al-ilahi. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's address, a lot is implicit, a lot is unstated, a lot is indicated, a lot is alluded to, a lot is necessarily there, but not explicit. Right? So they train you in appreciating these dilalat, both of the mantuq and the maskut, what is affirmed and what is silent about. Right? But you can't just come up with your own theories. You have to see how the ulama have understood, because they've read these things deeply. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه.